You ever hear your own son tell the neighbors you're losing your mind while you're standing right there? It's a sound you don't forget, like glass shattering, except the shards are pieces of you. But I picked them up, one by one, and built something sharp enough to cut him down to size. My name's Lorraine Carter, 68 years old, mother of one, at least by blood. Before I start, tell me, where are you watching from? I want to know how far this story travels, how far the truth can carry when someone tries to bury it in lies. I live in a small, tight-knit neighborhood in Madison, Wisconsin. The kind of place where people still wave at each other from their driveways, where you notice when a new car shows up, and gossip flows faster than the mail. I've been here for over 30 years. Raised my boy, Caleb, in this very house. Worked double shifts as a nurse, took in laundry on the side, paid off my mortgage penny by penny. I thought this home was my fortress, my safe place. But safety's a funny thing. You don't lose it in one loud crash, you lose it in whispers. It started on a Tuesday afternoon. I was pruning the roses out front, gloves on, sun on my back, when I heard voices from the other side of the hedge. Mrs. Atkins, my neighbor from across the street, and Caleb. She's always been the kind who asks a question just to spread the answer. He was leaning on the fence, telling her about how worried he was for me. She's not herself lately, he said with that slow, pitying tone. Forgets things, misplaces important papers. I'm thinking about stepping in before it gets, unsafe. Unsafe. That word stuck in my chest like a thorn. Mrs. Atkins murmured something about how hard it must be, and he sighed like the weight of the world was on him. It's for her own good, he added, as if he were rehearsing the line for someone more important. You'll see. I stood there frozen, my hands gripping the shears so tight I could feel the bones press against the gloves. He was talking about me like I wasn't even a few feet away, like I didn't hear every syllable. And the worst part, he was performing. Every pause, every furrowed brow, he was laying groundwork, building a story where he was the noble son, and I was the doddering, confused mother who needed saving. By the time he came inside, whistling like he'd done me a favor, I'd tucked away my expression. I made tea, asked about his day. He smiled, told me I looked tired, and suggested I take it easy. Then he left, and I sat there, tea untouched, staring at the wall. Over the next week, I noticed it happening more. Little comments, dropped like breadcrumbs, leading neighbors to an image of me as fragile, forgetful, helpless. It was subtle but deliberate. And Caleb? He played both sides. With me, he was patient, offering to help with my mail, my finances, even my keys. With them, he was the dutiful guardian-to-be, bracing himself for the burden. But here's the thing about me. I've spent decades in hospital wards, watching people hide pain, watching liars convince themselves they were saints. I know how to see the truth beneath a smile. And I knew my son wasn't worried about my safety. He was circling something, waiting for me to falter so he could swoop in, not to protect me, but to take control. I didn't have proof yet, just a gut-deep certainty, and I've learned to trust that. So I started writing things down. Times, dates, what he said, who was there, how they reacted. Every whisper became an entry in a small leather notebook I kept in my nightstand. I didn't tell anyone, not even my sister Ruth, because this wasn't just gossip. This was preparation. I didn't know exactly what he was planning, but I knew this. When the time came, I wouldn't just defend myself. I'd make sure everyone watching knew exactly who he really was. And I already had the perfect audience. The shift was slow enough that if I hadn't been watching for it, I might have convinced myself it was nothing. But once you notice the way eyes linger a little too long, the way conversations cut off when you step into earshot, you can't unsee it. Mrs. Atkins stopped asking if I could join her for coffee. Mr. and Mrs. Delgado waved from their porch, but didn't come over like they used to. Even the mailman who used to drop by the back door for a chat started leaving envelopes at the front step without knocking. It wasn't malice, it was pity. And pity is worse, because pity says, we believe what we've been told. One Thursday morning, I caught a glimpse of Caleb out front talking to the new couple, Brian and Kelsey. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the performance in his body language. Shoulders hunched in concern, a slow, sympathetic shake of the head. At one point, he gestured toward the house, and both of them glanced at the front window. I stayed still behind the curtain, heart pounding. This wasn't idle gossip anymore. He was recruiting witnesses. That evening, he brought over a folder. "Thought we could go over some bills together, Mum," he said, all smiles. "You know, keep things organized." He laid the papers out on the table. Utility bills, insurance statements, even my property tax notice. "You missed the payment on this one," he said, tapping the tax form. "No, I didn't," I replied. "I paid it last month." He gave me that look, the one people reserve for a confused child. "It's okay if you forgot. Happens to everyone." I wanted to slap the expression off his face. Instead, I excused myself, went to my desk, and returned with the stamped receipt from the county clerk's office. I placed it in front of him without a word. He blinked, glanced at the receipt, then shrugged. Well, mistakes happen on both ends. Just trying to help. But I saw the flicker in his eyes. That wasn't a mistake he'd stumbled into. That was a test. He'd been hoping I didn't have proof, that he could add another incident to his mental list. After he left, I sat at the table and thought about motive. Why go through the trouble of painting me as incompetent? There was only one answer that made sense. Control of my assets. The house, the savings, the pension, all of it. If he could prove I was mentally unfit, he could get power of attorney. And once that happened, everything I worked for would be his to do with as he pleased. The thought turned my stomach. Not because of the money, I've never been greedy, but because it was my son, the boy I'd carried, nursed through fevers, defended in schoolyard fights. The man I'd believed would be my ally in my final years. I could feel the edges of something hardening inside me, the soft, forgiving part that wanted to believe this was a misunderstanding was dying fast. That weekend, Ruth came by. She's my younger sister by 4 years, still sharp as a tack and twice as blunt. Over tea, she told me she'd heard from a friend that Caleb was talking to someone downtown about next steps for me. He didn't say it straight out, she admitted, but it sounded like legal stuff. My hand tightened around my cup. Like guardianship? Ruth's lips pressed into a thin line. "Lorraine, be careful. He's setting up a story, and once that story gets into the right ears, it's hard to erase." I already knew that. I'd seen enough patients lose their rights because someone whispered the right things to the right people, and I wasn't about to be one of them. That night, I opened my notebook and began a second column beside my notes. Potential witnesses. Every neighbor he spoke to. Every slip of paper he tried to organize for me. Every moment he tested the waters. I didn't just want to protect myself. I wanted to dismantle whatever he was building, brick by brick, in full view of the people he'd enlisted. And that meant patience, timing, choosing the moment when every single one of them would be looking directly at him. I knew the opportunity would come. I just didn't realize how perfectly it would deliver itself. The first real breach happened on a Monday morning. I'd gone to the bank to deposit a check from my old pension plan. Nothing large, just the annual adjustment payout, but enough to cover a couple months' groceries. When I handed my ID to the teller, she hesitated. "Mrs. Carter," she said carefully, "there's a note here on your account. It says your son, Caleb Carter, has been added as a joint holder. Effective last Friday." The air left my lungs. "That's not possible," I said. "I didn't sign anything." She tilted her computer screen slightly away, like she didn't want to be caught in the middle. "All I can say is, there's a signature on file." I asked to see it. When she turned the paper around, I almost laughed. Almost. The scrawl across the line was a crude imitation of mine, missing the loop on the L and crooked in a way my hand never would be. My fingers tingled. This wasn't just talk anymore. This was theft in slow motion. I asked the teller to print me a copy of the document. She glanced around, lowered her voice, and slid it across the counter. "If you need to dispute it, start soon," she said. "These things get harder once they're processed." I left the bank with the paper in my bag and a storm in my chest. Caleb had crossed a line you can't uncross, and now I had physical proof. That afternoon he showed up unannounced, arms full of takeout. "Brought you lunch, Mum," he said, all warmth and charm. "Thought we could go over your utility bills while we eat." I set the bag on the counter and looked him in the eye. "You went to my bank." He froze for half a second, so quick most people wouldn't notice. Then he smiled. "Oh, that? Just trying to help manage things for you. Less for you to worry about." "I didn't sign anything," I said. His smile tightened. "Maybe you forgot." There it was again, the subtle jab, the little seed of doubt he wanted others to hear and believe, but I wasn't giving him the satisfaction. "I have the form, with the fake signature." The pause that followed was long enough to hear the refrigerator hum. Finally, he laughed. "Mum, you're overthinking this. I can undo it if you want." Undo it? No. That would let him slip away, claim it was a misunderstanding. I wanted him to own this in front of every set of eyes he'd been feeding his lies to. That night, I called Ruth. I told her everything. The bank, the signature, the pattern I'd been documenting. She didn't gasp. She didn't say she was shocked. She just said, "It's time to make this official." We called a lawyer the next morning. I slid my notebook across the desk, the bank form on top. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Denise, skimmed the pages. "You've got a strong case for fraud and undue influence," she said. "If you want to file for a restraining order, I can have papers ready within a week." "Can we serve him at my house?" I asked. She looked up. "You want him served in front of the neighbors?" I met her gaze and nodded. "I want him served in front of everyone he's been talking to." Denise didn't flinch. "We can arrange that. And if you'd like, we can have an officer present. Adds weight." The plan took shape quickly after that. Court date secured. Officer lined up. Papers ready. All I had to do was pick the moment. And life, or maybe karma, handed it to me on a silver platter. Caleb was hosting what he called a neighborhood check-in at my house the following Saturday. His idea, apparently, to discuss ways we can support Mum as she transitions into this new stage of life. The audacity almost made me choke. He'd already invited half the block. I told him I'd make lemonade, but in my head, I was already picturing the knock at the door. The days leading up to Saturday were a masterclass in keeping my face still. Caleb came by twice, each time with a fresh wave of helpfulness, rearranging my pantry, checking my mail before I could, even bringing over a binder labeled Mum's Household Management. He thought he was tightening his grip. In reality, every move he made just added another layer to my case. I busied myself with preparations, letting him believe I was grateful for his efforts. I baked cookies, polished the silver lemonade pitcher Daniel and I had received as a wedding gift, and arranged chairs in a semicircle on the front lawn. "Make it welcoming," he said, handing me a stack of printed agendas for the meeting. I took one look at the agenda and nearly laughed. It was titled, "Planning for Mum's Future Underneath, Reviewing Household Safety, Organizing Finances, Potential Assisted Living Options." Assisted living? For a woman who still shoveled her own driveway last winter and walked a mile every morning. I didn't challenge him. I just tucked the agenda into my apron and asked if he'd pick up more ice. As soon as he left, I called Officer Daniels, the man Denise had arranged to serve the papers. We finalized the timing. He'd arrive 20 minutes into the gathering, just as Caleb hit the organizing finances point. The neighbors would be comfortable by then, drinks in hand, paying full attention. Saturday morning came bright and hot. I wore a pale blue blouse and my favorite slacks, hair pinned neatly back. Calm, capable, not the losing it image Caleb had painted. I made 2 pitchers of lemonade, set out the cookies, and watered the roses so the air smelled faintly sweet. My home had never looked more inviting. At 2 p.m., the first guests arrived. Mrs. Atkins, of course, eager for front-row gossip. The Delgados came next, then Brian and Kelsey with a fruit platter. One by one, the people Caleb had been feeding his narrative to filed in, greeting me with cautious smiles, their eyes scanning for signs of frailty. I greeted each warmly, offering drinks, asking after their families. If they expected confusion or forgetfulness, they found none. Caleb arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in a crisp polo and khakis, a clipboard under his arm. He gave me a kiss on the cheek, staged for the crowd, and began making the rounds, shaking hands, chuckling softly as if he were the host. And in a way, he thought he was. He stood at the front of the group, clapped his hands together. "Thanks for coming, everyone. I know you're busy, but it means a lot that you care enough to help Mum as she navigates some changes." I kept my face serene, hands folded in my lap. He started with household safety, pointing out a throw rug near the door he claimed was a tripping hazard. Mrs. Atkins nodded gravely, jotting a note. I caught her eye and smiled, not the brittle smile of someone under scrutiny, but the calm, steady smile of a woman who knows the ending to the story. 15 minutes in, Caleb moved to the second item: finances. He spoke about streamlining responsibilities and ensuring nothing gets lost in the shuffle. His phrasing was careful, meant to sound like concern, but dripping with possession. That's when I saw a white sedan pull up to the curb. My pulse quickened. 2 figures stepped out, Officer Daniels in uniform and a plainclothes process server with a thick envelope in hand. They spoke briefly, then walked up the path. I didn't move. I wanted Caleb to feel the shift before he saw it. The murmurs started when the uniforms came into view. Heads turned. Mrs. Atkins's pen froze mid-note. Brian set down his lemonade. "Excuse me a moment," Officer Daniels said as he approached, his voice clear enough for the whole group to hear. He looked at his clipboard, then at Caleb. "Caleb Carter?" Caleb blinked, glanced around as if someone else might answer for him. Yeah?" The process server stepped forward, holding out the envelope. "You've been served." For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the cicadas in the trees. Caleb stood frozen, one hand still hovering over his clipboard. What is this?" he stammered, glancing at me like I'd suddenly sprouted horns. "Legal documents," the process server replied matter-of-factly. "Restraining order, fraud allegations, and notice of an upcoming court hearing. You'll find all the details inside." Caleb laughed a short, breathless sound that didn't match his eyes. This is ridiculous. Mum, what's going on? You don't understand what they've given me." "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice calm but carrying across the yard. "And so will everyone else in a minute." The neighbors leaned forward, their gazes ping-ponging between us. I could see Mrs. Atkins's lips part, Brian's brow furrow. No one was moving. They were transfixed. Caleb shook his head, chuckling like he was still in control. "She's been confused lately," he told the group. "Someone's put ideas in her head." I reached for the small leather notebook I'd placed on the side table before the gathering. My hand didn't shake. "You mean like the idea that you could add yourself to my bank account without my consent?" I opened the notebook to the photocopy of the forged signature and held it up so the front row could see. "Or maybe the idea that you could tell my neighbors I was losing my memory to justify taking control of my finances." A murmur rippled through the group. Mrs. Delgado leaned toward her husband, whispering something that made his jaw tighten. Caleb's face reddened. "You're twisting this. I was trying to protect you. By telling people I was unsafe in my own home." I stepped closer, the edge in my voice sharpening. "By hosting a meeting about my future, without ever asking me what I wanted. By faking my signature so you could get access to money you didn't earn. The silence deepened. Even the kids next door, who had been playing with a basketball in the driveway, stopped dribbling and watched. Officer Daniels cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, I advise you to read those papers carefully. You have a court date in 10 days. Until then, you're not to contact your mother or access any of her accounts." Caleb's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced at the neighbors, his audience, but the warmth he'd counted on was gone. In its place was something colder, heavier, judgment. I took a slow breath, letting the moment stretch. "You wanted them to see me as weak, Caleb. Now they can see exactly how strong I am." Mrs. Atkins looked down at her lap, cheeks flushed. The Delgados exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. Brian shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing he'd been an extra in a show he didn't know was fiction. Caleb clutched the envelope, his knuckles white. "You'll regret this," he muttered. I shook my head. "No, son. I regret letting it go on as long as I did." I turned to the group, my voice steady. "I invited you here today because you've all been hearing one version of a story. Now you have the other. And when you hear whispers in the future, I hope you'll remember to ask the person being whispered about before you decide what's true." No one said a word. Caleb backed toward the sidewalk, eyes darting anywhere but at me. The process server and Officer Daniels stepped aside to let him pass. The sound of his footsteps on the pavement felt like the first real exhale I'd had in weeks. When he reached his car, he turned once more, as if he might say something. But whatever words he'd been preparing died in his throat. He got in, slammed the door, and drove away. The yard was still. The neighbors looked at me, then at each other. A few stood to leave. Mrs. Atkins paused. She passed me, her eyes softer than they'd been in months. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "That's why I did this." The driveway was almost empty by the time I realized I was still holding the notebook. My fingers had pressed into the leather so long that faint half-moons marked my skin. The Delgados were the first to approach me. Mr. Delgado cleared his throat. "If I'd known, I wouldn't have—" He shook his head, his wife touching his arm. "You don't owe me an explanation, Lorraine, but you do have my apology." I gave a small smile. Apology accepted. Brian and Kelsey came next, the fruit platter still untouched in Kelsey's hands. "We didn't mean to," she began, but her voice faltered. Brian finished for her. "We just believed him. He seemed so convincing." "That's the thing about convincing people," I said, setting the notebook down on the table. "They're not always telling the truth." Mrs. Atkins lingered near the roses, her gaze fixed on the blooms. She finally walked over, her voice low. "I've seen enough in my life to know when a story's been spun. I should have asked you first." She hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, you handled that with more grace than I would have." Grace. I wasn't sure that's what it had been. Inside, I felt like I'd just survived a storm, the kind that strips the leaves off trees and leaves everything smelling raw and metallic. But I nodded. "Thank you." When the last car pulled away, the quiet hit me like a wave. The hum of conversation, the rustle of papers, the click of cameras on cell phones all gone. Just the creak of my porch steps as I sat down, the wood warm beneath me from the sun. I let out a long, slow breath. My hands were steady now, but my chest felt heavy in a different way. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of grief. This wasn't the outcome I'd ever imagined for my son and me. I'd wanted distance from his lies, not a permanent fracture. But he'd made his choice, and I'd made mine. Ruth came by not long after, carrying a paper bag that smelled of cinnamon and sugar. "You were a damn sight braver than most people would have been," she said, handing me a still warm donut. I bit into it, the sweetness a sharp contrast to the bitter taste of the afternoon. It didn't feel brave. It felt necessary. We sat in silence for a while, the occasional car passing on the street. "He's going to try again," Ruth said finally. "People like him don't just stop." "I know," I replied. "That's why I've got the court date, and why I'm not letting my guard down again." As the sun dipped lower, I walked to the edge of the yard, looking at the roses. A few petals had fallen during the commotion, but most stood tall, their stems straight, their blooms unshaken. I thought about how I'd pruned them earlier that week, cutting away the weak branches so the strong ones could thrive. Sometimes, survival meant removing what was hurting you, even if it used to be something you loved. When I turned back toward the house, Ruth was holding my notebook. "You going to keep this going?" she asked. I nodded. "It's my insurance. Every word in here is proof. And if anyone ever tries to paint me as something I'm not, I'll have it ready." She set it back in my hands, her eyes steady. "Then you're not just surviving, Lorraine. You're making sure no one writes your story but you." For the first time in weeks, I felt the corners of my mouth lift without force. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was the beginning of something lighter. The courthouse in Madison isn't grand. No marble columns, no sweeping staircases, just a squat brick building with metal detectors at the entrance and the faint smell of floor polish in the air. I'd been there before, years ago, to testify for a patient in a medical case, but this time, the stakes were mine. Ruth sat beside me in the small waiting area, her hands folded around a travel mug of coffee. Across the room, Caleb slouched in a chair, scrolling his phone, jaw tight. He hadn't looked at me since walking in. When our case was called, I stepped into the hearing room with my notebook tucked under my arm. Denise, my lawyer, moved with a purposeful calm, her papers neatly stacked. Caleb's attorney, a younger man with a too shiny tie, followed him to the opposite table. The judge, a woman with keen eyes and silver hair, listened as Denise laid out the timeline, the whispers to neighbors, the forged bank signature, the unauthorized account change, and the gathering where the legal documents had been served. She slid the forged signature across the bench, alongside the bank's verification, and my receipt showing the original payment Caleb had claimed I'd missed. Then came my turn. Denise asked only 2 questions. "Mrs. Carter, are you capable of managing your own affairs?" "Yes." "And do you have evidence that your son attempted to gain control of your assets without consent?" I lifted the notebook, holding it like a shield. "Every word is here, every time, every witness." When it was Caleb's turn, he leaned into the microphone with feigned exasperation. "Your Honor, I was trying to help my mother. She's been struggling, misplacing bills, forgetting things. I thought adding myself to her account was the safest way to protect her." The judge flipped through the documents. "Then why forge her signature instead of asking her permission?" Caleb hesitated. "I didn't think she'd understand. Or," the judge said, her tone cool, "you knew she would, and she'd say no." The words landed like a stone in still water. Caleb's attorney shifted in his seat, but didn't object. In less than 20 minutes, the decision was made. The restraining order was upheld. Caleb was ordered to remove himself from all accounts immediately. The judge also noted that further attempts to interfere with my finances or living situation could result in criminal charges. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply nodded, the weight in my chest loosening a little. Outside, the air was crisp with the first hints of autumn. Caleb brushed past me on the steps, muttering something I couldn't catch. I didn't turn to follow. That chapter was closing, and I had no interest in rereading it. Ruth walked beside me toward the car. "You got what you came for?" she said. "Not everything," I replied, "but enough." That evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, the notebook on my lap. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when people are reevaluating what they think they know. I knew some would still whisper they always do, but the story had changed. I'd taken it back. And as the sun dipped low, casting the roses in gold, I realized something. The damage Caleb had done to my trust would never fully heal. But my dignity, that was mine again, and I'd guard it with everything I had left. They say you can't choose your family. Maybe that's true, but you can choose how much of yourself you let them take. It's been 3 weeks since the court hearing. Caleb hasn't called. He hasn't shown up at my door. Part of me wonders if he's nursing his pride or plotting his next move. The other part, the larger part, doesn't care. The neighbors have been different. Mrs. Atkins dropped off a pie last Thursday without a word, just a nod. The Delgados waved from their porch like they used to. Even Brian and Kelsey stopped by with a bag of groceries. Awkward, but genuine. I didn't do this for them. I did it because I refused to vanish into the version of me someone else decided to tell. But it's funny how the truth, once dragged into daylight, can ripple out farther than you expect. I've still got my notebook. I still write in it not out of fear now, but habit, because memory is a kind of armor, and I plan to keep mine sharp. If you've listened this far, remember this. Sometimes the best way to answer a lie is not with shouting, but with a stage big enough for everyone to watch it collapse. That Saturday afternoon, my son tried to make me the fragile woman in his story. Instead, I became the author of the ending, and I made sure he heard the last line.